When Second Lieutenant John Spike Nasmyth climbed into his F-4 Phantom II on September 4, 1966, to fly a combat mission over Vietnam, he never foresaw that he'd be blown out of the sky by a surface-to-air missile. The last words he heard before his jet was transformed into a lump of crumpled metal wreckage were from his guy in back, Ray Salzarulo, a pilot systems operator. "Hey Spike, here comes another." On the ground, he was immediately surrounded by the North Vietnamese, some of whom started to beat him before hauling him away to collect their bounty. They took him to the infamous Hanoi Hilton, the first of several prison camps, which would become his home for the next 2,355 days.
I was born in Billings, Montana, November the 14th, 1940, and my family moved from Billings to California when I was a kid, 4 or 5 years old. Pasadena, then we ended up Monterey Park, then we ended up South San Gabriel, and I went to Monterey Vista Grade School in San Gabriel, and then the Rosemead High School in Rosemead. And I graduated from high school in 1958 and went off to the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho for my college education. The University of Idaho, it was a land-grant college, so all men who were physically okay were required to take first 2 years of Reserve Officer Training Corps, either Army or Air Force, and I picked Air Force, I'm not sure why. But prior to my junior year, one of my upperclassmen in my fraternity house, a guy named Jim Lunty, suggested to me that I go to advanced ROTC, which would be my junior and senior, and I said, why? He said, well, you know, there's a war starting in Southeast Asia, and if you go to war as an officer, you're not going to be crawling around out in the jungle with the rest of the grunts. I thought, oh, good idea. So I applied for advanced ROTC in the Air Force, and I was accepted. Took a bunch of exams, and I passed the physical, and they said, you're qualified as a pilot physically, and so if you graduate, we'll send you off to pilot training. I thought, wow, sounds good to me. So that's how simply I ended up being an Air Force pilot, was just by a bunch of chances in the University of Idaho. So anyway, my senior year, the ROTC even sent me to get my private pilot's license. So my first flying was in a Cessna 172 at the Pullman Moscow Regional Airport. I graduated in June of 1962 at the University of Idaho with a degree in psychology, and I got my commission as a second lieutenant that same day, and a couple of months later I was sent off to my first Air Force assignment at pilot training at Del Rio, Texas, Lafayette Air Force Base. And I reported there, I think, in late September of 1962, and I started pilot training, which was in those days 55 weeks long. And it was a great year of flying and learning all about airplanes and weather and other stuff they teach you in pilot training. I flew the T-37 the first half, which is a twin-engine little side-by-side jet trainer. And on my second half of pilot training, I flew the T-33, which is an old clunker, a front pilot in the front, instructor in the back, single-engine jet. It was really a fun airplane to fly. Upon graduation, in those days, the way it worked was the top guy in the class got the first assignment he wanted. So we started, 40 of us started and 17 graduated. And so number one got first assignment. He picked up with number two, and I picked the F-4 Phantom at MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, Florida. And after graduation in October of 1963, I went off to survival school in Stead Air Force Base in Reno, and I was there. I remember exactly when I was there because President Kennedy was assassinated as the night we were celebrating finishing survival school. I remember the next morning waking up and turning on the TV in the hotel somewhere, and Kennedy had been killed. So what was that? November of 1963, I think that was. Anyway, after survival school, I went off to Tampa, Florida, where I started my initial checkout, the F4 Phantom, except for one problem: we didn't have any. So we messed around there for a couple of months, and I went off to water survival school and paratrooper school. The Air Force had a requirement that at least one pilot in each fighter squadron was a parachute jump qualified forward air control, in case you had to go on the ground and control airstrikes. And since we had no airplanes, I became a paratrooper. I also went to jump forward air control school, and finally we started getting brand new F4s from the factory, and we started checking out in the Phantom. First assignment was air defense in Okinawa, where we were guarding Okinawa from the hordes of Chinese who might attack us and start World War III. Nothing happened, of course, so most of our time we just messed around doing practice flying, and with the odd scramble, it was usually some airliner that got lost. Back to MacDill, back to Okinawa again, back to MacDill. Time passed, and I finally got my assignment to Ubon Air Force Base, Thailand, in March of 1966, where I went off to the war. And I was stationed at Ubon in the 555th TAC Fighter Squadron, and it was a bunch of good guys who I all knew, all of them from MacDill. They'd all been there in one squadron or another, where it was just kind of like homecoming. Anyway, I flew around with those guys for a little while, and most of them were finishing their tour and leaving, and all of a sudden, me going from a very junior lieutenant, I was one of the senior pilots in the squadron, went from being number 4 to being flight leader sometimes as a first lieutenant, because I became one of the senior guys in the squadron. Anyway, September the 3rd was, I remember the last night we had a big blow up in the officers club, and had a few beers in remembrance of a friend of mine who crashed, and he'd survived but was badly injured. And I remember toasting to my friend Bob Walmsley as he was shipped off in a medevac flight to the Philippines from very severe injuries. His backseater was killed in the crash. That was my last night of freedom, and I remember spending it with a very lovely girlfriend whose name I don't remember, but I called her, in the book I wrote, I called her Supa Songshri, just mainly because I couldn't remember her real name. And the next day I reported early for a flight, and we had our briefing. Took off, I think, rather early. Took off as almost we always did, took off from Ubon and flew north to northern Laos, where we met with a KC-135 tanker and refueled, airborne refueling, which sounds pretty exotic, but it's really not that hard to do. Topped up with fuel and headed into our target. Is a model of the exact F4 I was flying the day I was shot down, and the same number and the same bomb load. As you can see, this airplane is carrying 5 1,000-pound bombs, 3 in the middle and 2 on the right side. 2 heat-seeking Sidewinder missiles on the left side, and 4 Sparrow radar-guided missiles, which are more or less part of the plane. These 2 gadgets out here are external fuel tanks. Each of them holds 260 gallons. So this is the plane I was flying the day I was shot down. 12 miles north of Hanoi, where 2 roads intersect, and we were supposed to bomb a known oil storage, fuel storage, right at the intersection. So the plan is to come in and very low to the ground, pull up full afterburner, pull up to about 10,000 feet, roll upside down, pull into a 45-degree dive angle, dive down at the target, 450 knots, 2,500 feet above the ground, hit the bomb release switch, the bombs fall off, you pull off and take off the other direction. A few seconds later, the bombs hit the ground. If everything's perfect, they hit a bullseye and you blow up the target. Well, didn't quite happen that way. As we were coming in, flight leader had pulled up, and I was just about to pull up behind him, number two, and I saw coming from the right a SAM missile. So I remember calling, we happened to be called Satan Flight. I called Satan Flight, SAM at 2 o'clock low, break down and to the right to dodge it. So I didn't pay any attention to what lead did, but I know what I did. I pulled upside down and dove toward the ground. And if you did this effectively and turn hard, an airplane can turn harder than a SAM missile can turn, because it's a long, skinny telephone pole looking thing going really fast, and so we could make a hard G turn and they couldn't. So it's simple to dodge if you see them. So we went down, the missile went by harmlessly, and don't know what happened to it. So after the missile went by, I pulled back to join up with lead like a good number two, continue to pull afterburner and pull up, and right about this time my backseater said the last words of his short life, "Hey Spike, here comes," and I looked to the left, and here come another SAM missile from the opposite direction, and I just had time to say, "Oh, don't go off," and boom, it went off above and behind the cockpit, shrapnel raining down. I was wounded. A piece of shrapnel came in my arm, came out the bottom, broke this arm bone, stuck in my leg. Unfortunately, my backseater, Lieutenant Sal Zarullo, was killed in the explosion. I ejected from the plane. The majority of the plane went in, hit the ground, where his remains were recovered in 1998, so many years later. My parachute opened. I landed on the ground. I had been through jungle survival and water survival and every survival school you can imagine, but it didn't do me any good because I wasn't on the ground 5 minutes when I could hear hordes of Vietnamese beating their way through the bushes coming to get me. And they got me. I was probably on the ground 5 minutes. Probably a good thing they captured me because I was bleeding so bad that had they not been people around, I probably would have bled to death. Anyway, I was captured shortly thereafter, and the first guy who got me seemed to take great personal care of me, because I found out later that I was worth quite a bit of money as a bounty, and I was worth more as a live pilot than I was as a dead pilot. So this guy spent a lot of time protecting me from the civilians, and the meanest civilians were not the soldiers, as you might think, it was the teenagers. And the teenage girl, the one teenage girl, she really was the meanest of the gang. She had a long bamboo pole and she seemed bent on breaking my skull, because all she wanted to do was whack me on the head. So teenagers all over the world are rotten. So anyway, obviously the guy was able to keep him away from me, and I survived. So I was captured probably at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was, after the American planes went away, there was no chance in the world to rescue me. I was far, far, far out of helicopter range. So that afternoon I was marched down a hill and put under a tree, where I spent the majority of the day under a tree with the same group of people guarding me, and off to Hanoi. And I was at the Hanoi Hilton that night